This is Indigo Stray Conger. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist. Her passion is helping you find health and well being through a holistic approach of mind and body practices, according to her website, indigostray.com. INDIGOSTRAY.com. You can check her out after the webinar. And she's a licensed marriage and family therapist, like I said. She also has a background in some of the somatic practices, which she's going to explain. So right off the bat, why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, I've been a counselor since 2008, and before that, I've been a yoga teacher for many years and a massage therapist. And when I went to school for counseling, I really was most interested in the link between the physical and our emotional selves. And there's a whole world there that often gets ignored in traditional psychotherapy in terms of how we take care of ourselves, in terms of how we live within relationship.
Tonight we're going to be talking about the love drug. We've talked plenty over time, and we've inserted into many of our conversations the fact that there's more to this. There's more to the withdrawal we feel after a breakup. And all of that makes sense to you, and you have a really good explanation for some of what's going on.
Yeah, so when we talk about addiction, we often think about the mental compulsivity of seeking something or someone out, but there's very much a physical component. And when we get into a relationship, there's usually about 1.5 to 2 years of what's called limerence, or sometimes it's called new relationship energy, and it's where our limbic systems are literally resonating with each other, and we have this fabulous connection. There's lots of releases of oxytocin and dopamine, the happy neurotransmitters, and then even as the relationship progresses past that euphoric phase, we're cementing the attachment bonding that we have to that person. So when we're not with that person anymore, our body has a very real response to it, to not sleeping next to them at night, to not seeing them and making eye contact, to not having physical contact and play. So even if we know that a relationship is no longer healthy for some reason, our body can be counteracting that attempt to get through a relationship breakup by have lack of sleep or oversleep, not wanting to eat, eating too much, having nervous habits, not engaging in self-care, et cetera, from that very physical response.
You know, it's very difficult for people to admit having an addiction. And when we're talking about alcohol and we're talking about narcotics or things of that nature, even people who are in that state of mind and are using have a hard time making the admission that they have a problem. When it comes to love, even more so, because we don't see it as an addiction, and it's very hard for people that are going through it to actually see it that way. Why do you think it's so challenging for us to look at our own breakup withdrawal as a result of addiction or an addictive component?
Well, it is different from alcohol or drugs in the sense that you're talking about one specific person. You're not talking about all people. And so it is unique in that sense. And it's tangled up in our own story about ourselves. So I have the unique perspective of having worked with many couples that choose to break up, and one of them will decide to continue therapy. And I see some of those people who continue therapy deal with resilience in passing through that grief of the relationship ending. They learn lessons from it and they move on with their own life. And then other clients who have much more of these addictive properties, and I find that that's usually because they have a deeper story or narrative about that relationship. And it's usually a story about them being unlovable. And so if they can't make this relationship work with this person, then they're not going to make any relationship work. Then they are not a lovable or worthy person. And so if that's the story that's going on underneath the surface, then it's imperative to get that person back. It's imperative to reconnect, even though it's really no longer about that person. It's about what's happening within you.
Right, and that's another very difficult thing to understand, because we really focus on that person. Now, that person might have been the person to trigger all of what's going on, but we still remain focused on them when, in fact, you just said it's moved on from that. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, in fact, the further that we get from actual contact with a person, the more they become this archetype inside of us that has more to do with us and who we are in relationship and what we feel we've lost or don't have than it does about the reality of living day to day with that particular other person. And sometimes when people have not had contact with someone for a while and they still do feel very attached, they suddenly do have an interaction with that person and they realize that they don't have that addictive component anymore that they thought they did, because it didn't really have to do with that other person. It has to do with the pain that they're in. And oftentimes that it goes way earlier than that particular relationship. Usually for clients that don't have as much resilience in breakups, there's some attachment wounding that happened long, long before. Some person in their earlier life that there was a tough attachment bond to, that they didn't really get what they need, and that's coming up again now in a breakup.
Let's talk more about the body. How can we use our bodies to get out of addictive patterns?
There's a very real physical set of things that you can do to help get your nervous system back online and get out of that addictive pattern. And one of those things is physical activity. And certainly people hear that all the time and they think, well, I don't have the motivation to go on a treadmill for 30 minutes. But it doesn't have to be that. It can be literally 5 minutes of jumping around and flapping your arms or doing anything that inspires you to just literally get that stuff moving through your body, through your system. And other things that you can do is having affection. It doesn't have to be with another person that you've started to date. It can be with any person in your life or even any mammal in your life, dog, cat, something that has a limbic system, and having a 30-second hug, from a ventral to ventral hug with heart to heart, has a huge impact on being able to shift what's happening on that body level of addiction. And there's a few other things that you can do. Belly laughs are a big one. So if you're able to get out of yourself enough to laugh at something funny, that's actually huge, to be able to change your addictive pattern in that way.
Because these things are doing what? These things are causing certain neurotransmissions to happen?
Exactly. You're getting some release of what's been missing, what you're really having withdrawal from, that oxytocin and dopamine, and you're shifting what's happening in your nervous system. So oftentimes when you're in this stuck, painful place after a relationship ends, what's happening is that your sympathetic nervous system is online. That's that fight or flight, painful place, and your whole body can be rigid with this sense of danger, even though there's no danger in front of you to deal with or escape. So what these activities are doing, these physical things that you can do in a simple way, is to start to tell you that your body is a secure place, that you are safe, that you are home, that you can start to feel secure again in yourself.
So we're literally trying, in a sense, to get the brain on a different track.
Absolutely. The brain and body. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Now, how much of this happens through, for example, somatic therapy?
Somatic therapy is a broad term. So certainly there are aspects of this that I bring into the work that I do. Some somatic therapists are doing all physical work. Some somatic therapists are doing talk therapy and accessing the physical just by tracking it from a mental perspective. So there's a whole range of ways that you can approach working with the body.
And for those of us who just are not in any mood to even elevate ourselves, some of us can't even bring ourselves to it. We actually have to probably, you might say, force ourselves into it, huh?
Yes, and again, it's a small thing that you're forcing yourself to do. You don't have to leave your apartment and go to the gym. You can just focus on your breath. There's many breathing exercises you can do that help to get the body back online as well. And you can turn on your TV and watch something that you really think is going to be funny, and maybe you don't laugh at first, but if you can get some real belly laughs in there, even if you can't motivate to do any of that, even if you're stuck in your brain and you're having a lot of fantasies often about reconnecting with that person, can you shift the fantasy a little bit, which turns on the creative side of the brain, and have your fantasy be more about feeling strong, feeling resilient, feeling competent, feeling confident, and that can go a long way to rewiring what's happening in this negative cycle.
You often hear people say that I've had other exes and this didn't happen, but with this one particular ex, this was a major trigger. And I wonder, what is it? So there must be some sort of specific or unique circumstance that triggers all of these neurotransmissions about this person. It's not just the love, right? It's the source on some level.
Yeah, when we're in that painful place, we often attribute it to the specialness of that love, and certainly there's an element there. But oftentimes it has to do with where we are in our life, how resilient and self-reliant we're feeling in other aspects of ourselves, how good we're feeling about things beyond this relationship. And sometimes it's not just that we're in a bad place and so we fall down further. Sometimes we're in a really good place in that relationship and we finally let someone in when we never let someone in that deep before. And then when we lose that, it's like all these messages come flooding back. See, you never should have let someone in that deep to this vulnerable place. Now they've seen the real you, they've seen that you're unlovable, and this is gonna just happen again if you ever let anyone else in. That's a really common thread for people.
Irrespective now, for a moment, of an ex, when we do have these difficult voids within us, or the self-loathing, or the lack of confidence, what do we do just in general to build that piece of the puzzle?
And again, that comes back to the embodied self, because if you feel at home in your body and comfortable in your own skin, and you like the company you keep with yourself, that is going to shift how you feel not only after a breakup, but through everything that you do in your life. And it's actually very easy in our modern society to be completely cut off from our bodies, our sensations, our emotions. We have very mental jobs often. We can have a very sedentary life, or even if we do go and have physical activity, oftentimes it's on a treadmill, looking at a TV, distracting ourselves so that we're not aware of our bodies, we're not aware of our sensations, we're just getting some exercise. So there are a myriad of activities that you can do to varying levels of commitment and needing to get off the couch and out of the house that allow you to feel yourself.
So it sounds like what you're saying is that you're sort of walking back from the idea of being overly analytical about the situation. And what you're really saying, it seems like you're saying, is let's now bring attention to our bodies.
Absolutely, because that brings us into the now. When we feel our body now, we're in the present moment. Usually when we are feeling really upset after a breakup, we're caught up in these past preoccupations. We're going over and over memories in our head. We're rewriting them again and again and thinking, what if? And we're having anxieties about the future and getting stuck there and making any decisions moving forward. And when we can come into this moment, it often doesn't feel quite as bad if we can really arrive where we are right now.
That makes a lot of sense, because on one hand, if you think about it, if in fact we're talking about a physical addiction, then there might be a way to deal with this from a physical standpoint more than a mental one.
Yeah, get out of the head and start to shift what's happening physically. And if you can start to feel a little bit better in your body and feel yourself present, then the other obsessive thoughts can start to fall away.
But we're not talking about this to the exclusion of emotional learning and emotional and analytical therapy. This is an addition to, or the primary. How would you describe it?
Yes, I would say tangential too. But the base to doing any really good analytical work is that you've got to have a baseline of self-care. And oftentimes when we're in a dark place like this, that needs to be the primary focus, is how are you going to make sure that you are eating a decent amount of food and getting a decent amount of sunlight and making sure that you're moving and breathing in your body and connecting to other human beings. And if we can do that, even though it can be very hard to get out of that stuck place and do those simple things, that's when we can start to analyze what are the stories going on, what's really happening on a mental level. Because otherwise, there's no sense in going to that analytical place if the analytical place is so stuck and feeling horrible.
Can you explain some of these other areas that you're involved in? And then I want to get into how it can be therapeutic.
Sure. Well, I've taught yoga for many years, and yoga can mean a lot of things. It can be anything from a basic fun exercise to a deep way into your own mind and your own body. And I recently was at a conference with Bessel van der Kolk, who is a renowned trauma doctor. And he says that his clinicians often ask him, how do I know when my clients are ready for yoga? And he said, that's the wrong question to ask. If your clients aren't doing yoga, if they're not doing some kind of mindfulness, they're not ready for therapy. which is an answer as well to your earlier question about where's the place of analytical therapy with this more physical approach. If you don't have an awareness of yourself, of your own breath, of your own body, of your own emotions as they're happening before they reach this crescendo level, then it's hard to get in and do the analytical work. So, if you've never done yoga before, sure, go down to your local yoga center or gym and see what they have to offer. But many times that's an exercise approach. And so if you can find someone who has more of a knowledge of the well-rounded practice beyond just the physical postures, it can be a profound way to get to know yourself and feel comfortable in your own skin again.
And this idea of really sort of being with yourself, there are two ways to look at it. Being with oneself to some can mean just being, alone. But actually being with yourself is more than that. It's actually a proactive experience, isn't it?
Yes, and regardless of whether you are in relationship for the rest of your life or you are not, you're going to be with yourself the whole time. And relationships can sometimes act as a distraction to that. And when a relationship disappears, if you don't really like yourself, then that suddenly becomes really obvious. It becomes very apparent. And that's a painful experience, to feel like you don't feel worthy, you don't feel lovable.
So there's an active aloneness, and then there's a active or proactive aloneness, yes. And there's also a passive aloneness.
Right. And, a stereotypical example of a passive aloneness is I'm going to sit on the couch and watch, binge watch an entire series of TV. And that has its place, and it can be nice to distract yourself. But if that's what's happening every night, and when there's not a distraction, you feel like you just want to go to sleep or go do something else, then you're not actively learning to be in your own company. So even if you can take 5 minutes to be present with yourself, to breathe, to feel what you're really feeling, to let it be there without distractions, that can start to create a totally different way of being, of proactive aloneness, like you said.
It's interesting. We really don't talk about that much, proactive aloneness. Why do you think you don't hear enough about that?
Well, certainly our culture is a culture of distractions and busyness and being in relationship to the world and other people. So much so that if you feel like a naturally more introverted person, that's seen as perhaps there's something wrong with you. But in fact, your relationships with other people will be so much more rich when you come to them with an awareness of who you are, what you need, what you want, how you're feeling. So if you can start to turn that awareness on from a physical and emotional level, then your friendships, your relationships going forward will be so much more rich for that.
Remember Dark Fever. She's on day 2 of not initiating contact. We have a day count here. As far as day 2 goes, this was probably one of the best ones, so that's nice. I started a ton of projects to keep me busy, mostly gardening ones. Hopefully I haven't bit off more than I can chew, but I'm hoping that turning them into beautiful creations will give me some joy. So it's not just, so that can be part of the physical experience too, couldn't it?
Absolutely. Gardening is wonderful. You're getting sunshine, assuming you're gardening outside. You are feeling your body move. You can take the time to garden with awareness, with breath, with connection to yourself, and you can let yourself just be busy and immerse yourself in the work and distract yourself if you're starting to feel like your mind is spinning off. So that's a wonderful thing to do.
So I like what you said there. So even in gardening, it could actually be a proactive aloneness, not just for the sake of the busyness of gardening, but also to become aware of the centrally personal experience with oneself.
Yes, and we often have this idea of mindfulness or meditation as being people who want to go sit on a cushion for an hour, and sure, that's great, but just taking little pockets of time when you're doing whatever you normally do, as long as there's not a screen that's distracting you, talking that's distracting you, that you can be in yourself, feel your body, feel what sensations you're feeling, what is your breath doing, even if it's just 2 minutes, and you start to create a habit of that, that's going to change your relationship to yourself.
Right, and the 2 minutes can be like, if you really have a hard time committing to a full project, you can do 2 minutes of maybe drawing a picture of a garden or a flower.
Yeah. It can, adult coloring books became really popular over the last couple of years, and they can actually be great because they're turning on that creative part of the brain, which helps our body to feel like a safe place again. And they can be meditative. So even if you just pick up a marker for a couple minutes and absentmindedly doodle into an adult coloring book, that can be part of your healing process.
Now, one has to somehow be committed to healing if we still hold out hope that there may be a way to fix the relationship, or if we have the illusion that somehow it's not over. What does that do to the healing process?
It's hard to really get started until you let go, but you can't force that letting go. And oftentimes it's not helped by the fact that the person who's left us may have continued to try to initiate contact or give us some kind of hope. That makes it even harder to create boundaries and start that true healing work. But the healing work can happen while you're still holding out those hopes. You can use that as a mindfulness practice. Notice when it's coming up for you. You're not trying to stuff it down or push it away or do anything with it. But maybe every time you notice that you're having a fantasy or a thought about, well, maybe if, or maybe I can do that, just pause, take 3 breaths, focus on the exhale in particular more than the inhale, feel your body. Maybe the thoughts are there, maybe they're not. Again, you're not trying to stuff them or do anything to them. You're just using that as an opportunity to come back to yourself.
When you talk about the idea that we can still work on ourselves despite these illusions we may have, related to that is this issue of closure, for example, that until we get closure, it's going to be really hard for us to actually recognize that something is over. Like we desperately want the answers. We desperately want to turn the page knowing full well that there's been a period to the existence of the relationship. How important do you think closure is in general?
Closure is very important, but it doesn't usually come from where we think it's going to come from. Oftentimes we don't feel like we got closure, even if it was a very, very clear ending from the other person's perspective. Closure has to come from what's happening within us, and it can come at an unexpected time. Again, sometimes closure can happen when you've been obsessing about a person for a while and you happen to see them again and you realize that that dynamic isn't actually the same way, and you're able to close that door yourself. And these things that we're talking about in terms of self-care, coming back into relationship with yourself and your body, those are the building blocks to feeling your life fully and being able to at some point let go and walk away.
We hear often about comments from members about not being able to shut the mind off from these memories and these consistent thoughts that keep surfacing. And it can literally drive people crazy.
Yeah.
But from what you're saying, it's not so much about turning those things off as much as it's giving the mind an alternative and eventually hoping that the alternative will gain some traction.
Giving the mind an alternative, and again, the physical component is really important. So if there's some movement, if there's some breath, if there's even just awareness of sensations in the body, you're shifting what's happening in your nervous system, which in turn shifts what happens in your brain. But it literally is changing your reality. If you're in a really stuck place and you're fantasizing and feeling like you're in these stuck obsessive thoughts about your ex, if usually your body is very shut down at that point too. Usually the breath is very shallow. There's tensions in the body. You haven't moved very much recently. And so if you can shift that first, it starts to give room to those thoughts. Whereas if we try to just stuff those thoughts away and shut them down, and it can actually increase the cycle because we start to feel self-recriminating. Oh gosh, why can't I just stop thinking about this person? Why can't I turn these off? And those thoughts bubble over and become even more important and prominent. So instead of trying to have a relationship with those thoughts and get rid of them, you're simply turning your attention in a slightly different direction.
You know what's interesting about all of this that you talk about, all of these other activities that are physical in nature, is that we don't necessarily look at those activities for what they're meant to bring to us in the sense that you're characterizing them. So when we think about those activities, to us it seems ridiculous. Like even gardening, as one of our members had mentioned, you're hung up over an ex, you're in pain, and someone says, well, you should do some gardening. And we scoff at that. But what you're saying about these physical activities. What you're saying is that there's a deeper purpose in them that we're not realizing. How can you convince us of that when we're in the depths or in the throes of this and it's hard to be convinced?
Well, that's the thing, is that I don't have to convince you. In terms of anxiety, breath is the one thing that you can do that's going to shift a panic attack, for example, without you believing in it. There's lots of other interventions that work to greater or lesser success, but changing your breathing and practicing that before the panic attack happens, that works whether you believe in it or not. It just is. And that's true for these somatic interventions in general. One good example of what people might think of as kind of pathetic, but is actually profound, is I've heard clients say, I couldn't even get out of the house today. I stayed in all day and just kind of wrestled with my dog and played with him and used the laser pointer or whatever. And they thought, oh, that's just so ridiculous. Well, your dog, you have a profound relationship with and an attachment bond to. When you're engaging in that rough and tumble play, it lets your body know that you're secure and safe. And you're getting that limbic resonance with another mammal that you care about. And it's deeply healing and profound work. So it's not to be scoffed at. It's important.
Does it matter how long the relationship existed? Is there a difference between 6 months and 6 years if that connection was profound?
I hear people all the time offer up equations like, oh, it's going to take as many months as many years that you were together, or a certain amount of days for how much time you spent together. And there's no equation for that. It would be nice if we could just know in our heads that that particular day this pain is going to be done. But the process really, again, has more to do with you and where you're at and what that relationship meant to you and to your sense of self. And if the breakup, for example, like you said earlier, was sudden and unexpected, if we let that person in to a profound level that we never let someone in before, then it's going to be a lot more painful to move through. And we have some deep work to approach for ourselves.
Silent Mem, it's been close to a month since we've ended things. We weren't really in a relationship, only dating, and it still hurts. I can still remember all the texts he sent, right down to the emojis. And everything he said. He told me he wasn't looking to date at the moment and doesn't feel anything for me, which is why things ended. I thought I could be okay with it because I kind of expected it from him, but I guess not. And recently found out that he's been talking to this new girl whom his friends are matchmaking him with, and it makes me hurt even more. I don't know what else to do other than to load myself with loads of work so that I don't get the time to think and to wait for time to heal my wound. Interestingly, she brings up two things. One is the idea of memories. What role do memories play? And what about this physical experience can contravene the memory?
Well, the interesting thing about memories is that every time we revisit it, we're rewriting it. And so particularly if she's got this new pain, that there's a new person on the scene, we start to take those old memories and compare them. And it can add to that story that we have for ourselves that we're unworthy and we're unlovable because, hey, there's a new person, so it must have been me. It must be something that's broken about me. And so we take out all those shiny memories again and we strip them until they become something completely different. And when we talk about this physical stuff, it's getting you out of your head and into your body, because there's an endless rabbit hole you can go on with those memories and those stories. And it may feel like you're getting closer to a kernel of truth, but you're just getting further and further away from where you are right now.
What about the idea that we've done something wrong to bring us to this place, and that if only we could rectify it, things would be different? And if only we had a chance to rectify it. How do you see that how do you see that thought in how it plays out in our heartbreak?
That's one that comes up a lot. And one thing that's interesting about that is that it strangely gives us this backwards comfort to feel like we had some sort of control. That if we could just identify the one thing or the one moment that things went wrong, that we could have had control over how this went, because it shakes us to our very foundations to have somebody leave, especially if it's fast. But sometimes if it's slow too, it, like I said earlier, it shakes our worldview. And part of that worldview for ourselves is often that we have this sense that we have some control over our life and where it's going. And when a breakup happens, we lose that sense of control. So even though it feels painful to be going back and obsessing over what was the one thing that I could have done, it's actually acting as this counterproductive solve in the moment of, well, if I could just figure that one thing out, then I would feel like I had control over my life again. But you never really get there. You never really get that satisfaction. So it doesn't truly help us to heal.
Sometimes also when an ex, it's not always on us, when an ex seems to kind of come in and out of our lives, even if we've made a decision that we're ready to heal and we want to heal, but then we can't help ourselves when the ex pops in and it creates havoc and then pops right out after we now become sort of glued to the emotional connection again. That can be complicated. And in some ways, a lot of people are defenseless or feel defenseless and, not to succumb to that. What do you think?
Well, that ties into a couple of things. One is, again, that physical addiction, that if it's close enough to when the breakup happened, you still very much have a physical response to that person. And occasionally you can still have that physical response a decade down the line. And then also when we have that person come back, even if we felt like we've moved on, it taps into that sense that we can control things again. Like, oh, this time I'm going to write this story differently and I can erase that pain because this time it's going to be different. And then we double our pain because it doesn't work out differently.
Ultimately, in dealing with breakup pain and surviving and then moving on and finding someone new, there's probably a lot that has to happen for all of what has gone awry to actually, come together collectively on the right path. It's not insurmountable, but in your estimation, don't we have to be proactive in all forms for it to actually happen? Healing is a proactive experience, isn't it?
It's proactive, but oftentimes, again, people get too focused on focusing on the relationship and getting over the relationship. And that can actually be counterproductive because then we just start obsessing and trying to rewrite and think what if again. So the proactiveness is in being proactive in your own life, being proactive in being present with yourself. And again, those tiny physical interventions that you can have, 5 minutes of physical activity, that's a way to be proactive and start to heal, even though playing with your dog might not feel like you're addressing the relationship. You are doing the work.
All the work that you've done with respect to breakups, have you learned anything?
Oh, I've learned so much from my clients. The main thing I would say is that to see how the same external experience, the same length of time a relationship happened or the same amount that it seems like a person was attached to someone else can ripple in totally unexpected ways when a breakup occurs, because again, it's not totally about the relationship. So every person that I sit with can surprise me with what the story really is that's happening for them, and that slowly gets unearthed over time. And most of what's happening for them, it turns out, has very little to do with that object of their affections.
Do you find any ways in which men and women look at it differently?
Well, in our culture, men are oftentimes not very comfortable with their emotions other than sometimes anger. So that can happen in a couple of ways, that anger can become so dominant for a man who's going through a painful breakup, and it takes a lot more time to get to those underlying vulnerable emotions. I've also seen oftentimes men be very shut off to their emotions altogether, and then suddenly they show up in therapy 5 years later and they say, I'm having all these emotions. I didn't know they were there because I've been stuffing them down so long. That's not at all to say that women don't have many of their own issues that they're dealing with. But in terms of our culture, it does a huge disservice to men that they're not really encouraged to explore their emotions earlier in life or as adults. And so when it comes to a really challenging place like this, they often don't have the tools.